where she completed her doctorate in 2020. A critical engagement with ethical investing and corporate sustainability, her research contributes to debates in social studies of finance, moral philosophy, economic geography, and the cultural economy. And Richard Dennis, who will be joining us soon, is the Executive Director of the Australia Institute. Richard is a prominent Australian economist, author, and public policy commentator, and has spent the last 20 years moving between policy-focused roles in academia, federal politics, and think tanks. And we have closing remarks from Dr. Ihab Shaba. Ihab is a lecturer in human rights and social justice. Before joining the University of Sydney, Ihab worked both in community and government positions, including as a senior research and policy advisor at the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I'm the director of the Sydney Peace Foundation, which is based here at the university. The Peace Foundation is best known for the annual Sydney Peace Prize. And among our laureates are social justice, economic justice, and climate justice advocates like Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who was here earlier this year as a guest of the Australia Institute, Professor Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, Dr. Hannah Mashrawi, who is perhaps one of our most famous laureates, and movements including the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And this year, the award is going to the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, for the movement's highly respected humanitarian work, and particularly the unimaginable sacrifices of the Palestinian Red Crescent. Now, thank you all for submitting questions. They are diverse, they are fantastic. As David Kinley said, there's real curveballs there. But what they all do point to is our general disillusionment that we are increasingly part of a global financial and political system that isn't serving our interests. So, a quick summary of some of the concerns raised. Our planet is burning and climate emission reduction targets are largely ignored. And Australia's Environment Minister just approved 3 new coal mines. Inequality is rising. The fundamental freedoms of free speech and the right to protest are being undermined. International law is in tatters as Israel continues its genocidal assault on Palestine and now Lebanon with total impunity. And with the other conflicts in Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar have meant the military-industrial complex is thriving. So I could go on, but we are here today to explore what we can meaningfully do to address the challenges and affect some sort of change in the area of climate and human rights. Now, my first question is to Richard, who's not here yet. We had a lot of questions on superannuation, but I'll get to Richard when he gets here. So Claire, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to draw on the central question to your book, False Prophets of Ethical Capital, which examines the role of ethics in sustainable capitalism. You argue that popular ethical concerns about social and ecological issues are transformed by finance capital into opportunities for profit. Can you talk about this and what are the implications for social movements?
Sure. Thanks, Nani, and thanks everyone for coming today. So I guess I'll try and talk a little bit about the context first that kind of creates a situation where our ethical concerns become, are incorporated into financial markets, and that partly goes to some of the context that, around superannuation. So, of course, almost everybody in this room, if you have a job, or if you had a job in the Australian economy, you'll have a superannuation account. And so that has been part of a suite of policy measures that were introduced in the 1980s, where, amongst other things, risks and responsibilities which were previously socialised and organised through the state have been shifted to households and to individuals, have been shifted into the private sector. And so that's part of the context in which we're all enrolled into financial markets, whether we like it or not, compulsory superannuation. We're required to deliver 11%, or the university sector, sometimes 17% of our wages to the finance sector, whether we like it or not. And so this context is part of what Mark Fisher, for example, has called capitalist realism. a situation in which those sort of shifts in statecraft in the 1980s were happening around the same time as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the communist bloc, and the seeming triumph of Western capitalism and Western market economies. And so what Mark Fisher and others argue is that leads to a kind of market-based politics, to a kind of situation where it seems that it's not possible to dismantle capitalism, it's not possible to transcend capitalism, so we need to work within it, and so a kind of market-based politics flows from that. So we see, say for example, the anti-sweatshop movements of the 1990s against companies like Nike are a sort of an example. It's the use of consumer power and voting with our dollars. And to some extent, we see it, images of that in relation to superannuation. You might have seen billboards asking you, where's your super invested? Is your super invested in coal or fossil fuels? And there are a couple of things, I guess, a couple of things that I want to highlight about the implications of this from the perspective of political action and social movements. And the first is the way that it constrains who can participate in political action. So superannuation is highly concentrated. So even if we have to recognise also within Australia, even though many of us have superannuation accounts, that wealth is really concentrated in particular ways. And a lot of us have got, some of us have got a lot, and many of us have very little. But more significantly than that, perhaps, to the extent that some of what we're talking about today is, kind of has a colonial dimension to it. Just 7 countries invest nearly 90% of global pension fund assets. Just 7 countries, and Australia is one of them. And those countries represent a certain colonial, hegemonic kind of political and economic structure. So, there's a question of who can vote with their dollars through financial markets and decide, make ethical decisions, if you like, with their superannuation. And then the other important constraint, aside from the question of who can practice this kind of politics, I think is what kind of ethics can we practice with our money. And here, I guess I want to highlight the lion's share of responsible investment, so-called, concerns the integration of ESG or environmental, social and governance issues into investment decision making. And so that's the kind of the lion's share of what happens in the finance sector with respect to responsible investing. And there's an important constraint on the kinds of ESG issues that are typically considered, and that is financial materiality. So ESG issues will be considered in investment decisions to the extent that they have a financial impact on an investment portfolio. And most of us will probably recognise that ethical concerns don't stop at the point of profitability. As Matthew Lambert, for example, has argued, a financially constrained approach to business ethics fails at precisely the moment when it is most needed, which is the point at which it's costly to do what we might consider the right thing, or when doing the wrong thing is economically beneficial. And I think we see in the current situation in Gaza, for example, really clear evidence of that there isn't a financial imperative to divest from the firms which are driving the Israeli government's assault on Gaza and now Lebanon. In fact, our own superannuation fund has said quite explicitly in response to a question about geopolitical risk recently, we find that the market shakes off those geopolitical issues pretty quickly. This raises some really serious concerns about the limitations of practicing our politics through the market.
You were the first question.
How do I go?
The second question, which sort of set up Claire's question, but look, it's fine. We have had a lot of questions about superannuation. For example, where do I invest? What's a super fund? But with the growth of super, we are now all implicated in financial markets because of our, everyone here, not everybody, because of our retirement savings. Now, you've researched superannuation systems over many years, and especially the inequalities that superannuation funds bring. What kinds of possibilities does superannuation generate for people to exercise political power?
Oh, thanks, Mel, and apologies for being late. It was a complete conspiracy. Qantas cancelled 2 flights, and then I got on a Virgin flight which circled Sydney Airport for 45 minutes thanks to a thunderstorm.
But
So,
you don't hear that too late, so
no, but I just made it, so apologies. Look, I could talk about the inequalities of super till the cows come home. We've built a system that basically takes working life income inequality and then magnifies it in retirement. That's all it does. So if there's a gap between men and women when they're working, it'll be worse when they retire. If there's a gap between a nurse and a banker, it'll be worse when they retire. That's what super does. And the reason so few countries have got such a large percentage of these pension funds is most countries survive without them. Like, just to be clear, you don't have to have one. But we've made one, and we've made it one of the world's biggest ones, because every week we force you to spend 10.5% of your income buying a product. Imagine if we forced you to spend 10.5% of your income buying a car every week. We'd have a big car industry. If we forced you to spend 10.5% of your income buying computers, we'd have a big computer industry. Well, we force people to spend 10.5% of their income buying super, and now we've got one of the biggest, financial systems in the world. It's because we force people to buy it. So, given that we've done that, what can we do with it? Which is different from is it the best way to do things? Look, I think there's lots of things that we can do, but they're all limited in the ways you just heard. But limited doesn't mean there's no role for them. So I'll give you an example. The Australian Institute did some research back in 2001 that showed that a whole bunch of super funds are invested in nuclear weapons manufacturing and companies with a big exposure to nuclear arms. And we updated that recently, like a couple of months ago. And of the top 14 biggest super funds in Australia, 13 are invested in companies that provide nuclear, or play an important role in producing nuclear weapons. 13 of the biggest 14 funds. Now, a lot of those funds claim to screen out controversial weapons. So you might have chosen, and this is the problem with choice, you might have ticked the box, I'll have the ethical one, thanks, the one that screens out controversial weapons, because you missed the bit where they said nuclear weapons aren't controversial. So you might have not known that when you ticked the ethically screened fund, because that's the problem with all of this kind of stuff, is we're typically outsourcing these choices to someone else. So we're asking someone else to decide what's ethical on our behalf. We're asking someone else to decide which weapons are controversial on our behalf. And even after we've expressed that preference, we're expressing that preference to some people who say, but as a trustee, I've got an obligation to maximise returns. So I hear that you hate that idea, but on behalf of you, I'm going to go and do it anyway. So just to be clear, we force you to put money into super. You have no say in that. Okay, we force you, if you're a wage salary earner in Australia, to put 10% of your income into super, and then it's managed on your behalf by trustees who say, I know what's best for you. And if I say, well, I know what's best for me, get out of nuclear or get out of coal, they say, there, pat on the head, Richard, don't you understand? I'm your trustee, I know better than you. Now, the weird thing is, if this was a government doing this, you'd have libertarians and right-wingers going, oh, this is the oppressive nanny state telling us what's what. But it's worse than that. We've actually outsourced this decision-making to private entities that get to tell us, oh no, I've thought about it for you, there. So, yeah, you're spot on. The system is deeply problematic when it comes to inequality. It's deeply limited in what we can do. But at the same time, next time you're walking through the CBD, look up and think, we own all this. Not they, we. Like, it's terribly governed, and the avenues for us to actually express our ownership rights are trivial. But to give you a sense of it, you think Gina Reinhardt is rich. If she was a super fund, she'd be so small that APRA would be suggesting she get shut down. I mean this, right? 20 billion, 30 billion, these are small amounts. Super funds with hundreds of billions of dollars, they're our hundreds of billions. They're yours and mine. Our agents, the people making decisions on our behalf, have 10, 20 times the financial power of Gina Reinhardt. but they don't fear not, they promise not to use it. They promise you they won't use it. So we kind of wind up in this weird situation where you might have a company that's 60%, 70% owned by us, that's got one or two rich people that own 10 or 20% of the company, acting as if they run it. Because our trustees, investing our money on our behalf, promise, absolutely promise, not to throw their weight around in the board. And, sorry, I'll wrap up here, Mel, but think about the American election. At the last time Trump won, he got 25% of the vote. Hillary got 24%, 50% didn't vote. It's all the non-voters in the US that empower someone like Trump. We've now created a financial system where the null activity, the apathy, the determination not to exert their power on our behalf means that even though the majority of listed companies in Australia are owned by us and could be controlled by us, are actually run, at the behest of a very small number of people that own a very small number of shares. So I'm not optimistic that we'll fix this anytime soon, but the reality is we've been forced to spend a fortune on this stuff. We actually are now the beneficial owners of most of the stock exchange, but we kind of just rage impotently against it, while our trustees go and promise not to do much with it. If you're in self-managed super, you've got a lot more opportunities, either to be activist with your own money or activist in what you select. But if you're in big industry fund, why don't you get to vote for a trustee? Imagine that. Imagine if we could, have a voice in where our money is allocated.
There's more questions sort of about that effective ways to rage in the questions that follow. But I just want to move on to David now, who, with your research and you through your book Necessary Evil and your benchmark financial services human rights benchmark, you talk about finance and companies as being the evil we can't live without. Now we've just heard that maybe we should be living without. I mean, are you more positive about how companies, corporations can function? And there's also a second part to this question. Do you see a role for disruptive disruption to the financial systems through boycotts and divestment? Do they have a role in shaping up the system?
Well, firstly, I would have to say I am optimistic that all human rights lawyers have to be optimistic, otherwise you wouldn't survive. Can we live without finance? Well, frankly, no. The question is, how do you try and civilise it? What Claire and Richard pointed out is the extent to which finance can operate, as it were, on its own terms, and that's the real problem in a democracy. So that's what we have to disrupt. And the way I thought I would approach that is to just identify what are seen as the cultural pressures as well as the regulatory reforms that are now being mooted. And whether or not they will succeed is another matter, but they are issues that we can discuss and that at least lay the groundwork. First of all, the financial sector has been really slow to take on board the fact that it has got environmental and or human rights responsibilities. It always considered itself in the burgeoning growth of the idea of business and human rights, it considered itself a special case. Why? Because it doesn't dig the hole in the ground, it doesn't employ the people that sew footballs or t-shirts or whatever, so therefore it's not its responsibility. It's at least one step removed, maybe even 5 or 6 steps removed. When the 2011 UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights were promulgated, even then, when it was covering all businesses, which of course includes corporations, it took a statement from the then Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to say, this actually does cover you guys in finance, for finance to go, oh yeah, okay, we'll come along to the party. In a way, they have come to the party in this respect. Richard was alluding to it a moment ago. The growth of so-called ESG, environmental, social and governance funds, is enormous. At least the ones that are claimed to be ESG is truly monumental from where it was just 10 years ago. Two things about this. One is I think there is some rhetoric here that is useful, because when you've got people like Larry Fink, who governs or oversees the largest assets manager in the world, BlackRock, with $10 trillion worth of assets, he puts out these annual letters that talk to CEOs and say these are the important things that I think corporations should be looking at in the long term. It includes such things as human rights and the environment. But there's no doubt, there's absolutely no doubt that the attraction of ESG is such that many corporations and many financial entities just pay lip service to that ESG dimension. The point that was being made by Richard about the trustees not really doing what we think they should be doing or what we think they are doing. Certainly, when we looked at with the Financial Services Human Rights Benchmark, which was 22 listed financial entities, which does not include superannuation funds because they're not listed in the stock exchange. When we looked at them, one of the things that we found really striking was the fact that many of these large institutions did have human rights and environmental policies, but they sat in the middle of operational dissidence, not knowing what that means in operational forms, and at the top end, on the other side, a board that was not aware or not supporting or not owning that policy that was presented in the middle management, as it were. So a lack of true adherence to what they claim is their human rights awareness. So what have we got? Well, we've got now a number of entities looking at this so-called greenwashing, this lip service. Blue washing if it's human rights, greenwashing if it's environmental. Blue, I think, is the UN colour. ASIC, for instance, has got a current ongoing review of greenwashing within the financial sector in Australia. There have been litigation, there has been litigation brought against many banks, including Deutsche Bank, in both the EU, Switzerland, outside the EU, and in the United States. There is an expectation that financial sector entities do play a gatekeeping role with anti-money laundering. In other words, they know where their money is coming from, but there's been plenty of cases to show that they actually are not paying enough attention to where the money is coming from that's been deposited or being channeled through their financial services. There is, however, also a move in the sort of pure legal world that may show some signs of bringing the environmental and human rights issues into the core of what would be considered corporate law. Directors' duties, for instance, under our corporations law, and actually, interestingly, under the British Companies Act, have been read by some senior counsel to include the need to take on board the environmental and human rights footprint of your company. Why? Because if you do not take that on board, and it does have a material impact, a financial material impact on your company's prospects, then that would be considered a transgression of your duties to ensure that shareholders and everyone else benefit from the organisation and the running of this company. Now that's pushing the envelope at the moment in corporations law, but it is there and it's alive and has been a live discussion for the last 5 years. And then finally, as I said, an optimistic line. This is at least a step in the right direction. The EU has just recently passed a directive. It's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CS-DDD. The EU never goes for anything simple and straightforward. The CS-DDD is an instruction to all members of the EU to pass legislation that implements the directive as it's outlined. Now this directive is very interesting because it requires all corporations to have a due diligence policy in place for their supply chains, both upstream and downstream, looking for such things as modern slavery. This was an incredibly long, arduous negotiation within the EU, and it perhaps won't surprise you that the financial sector finally and tellingly won a concession to have itself effectively removed from the due diligence directive, at least in respect of downstream supply chain. In other words, they are not going to be held responsible for the loans that they do make to corporations who do dig a hole in the ground and poison the groundwater, or do employ people in a modern slavery circumstance. Having said that, two conditions have been attached to that. So at one level, that looks really unoptimistic. It's the financial sector getting a let up. But there are two ways in which I think that is perhaps less of a win than they might think. And I think the financial sector realizes this as well, because if you look at its website, the websites of the big corporations at the moment, the big financiers at the moment, and of their lawyers, most importantly, you can see them talking about the need to take this on board, this downstream due diligence. And the reason for that is twofold. One, in 2 years' time, there will be a review of whether the financial sector should remain outside this corporate sustainability due diligence directive. And I think there will be a lot of pressure to say, no, they've got to be brought back in. Secondly, all the corporations that are financed by our banks and by big financial sectors, including the shareholders like superannuations, they are required to have a due diligence policy. Now, if that due diligence policy requires them to look at who finances them and how well they are respecting the due diligence of the corporation they're financing, of course, indirectly, the financiers, the superannuation funds, the banks, are brought into that milieu. So it may seem rather technical, but the idea behind this is that this due diligence, this exposure of whether in fact you are excluding nuclear weapons or indeed any arms appropriately and with reasons, or if you're including them, what are the reasons to include them? That sort of exposure, that demand that you show what it is that you're doing, is one step towards making these entities more transparent, even if it will take some time, maybe another decade, maybe another generation, for them to be held regularly responsible. But it is a step in the right direction.
Richard, Claire, I mean, how confident are you that the safeguards, well, one, how they've been developed, but two, practically, they can...
Look, I guess I think, all right, let's imagine that we've got the finance system that we've got today, but we've got the cultural problems and environmental and economic problems of 200 years ago. So let's put modern slavery aside. Let's imagine there were super funds when there was slavery. Well, let's go back in time and imagine how would our trustees behave in a world in which there was slavery, in which there were...
Still is slavery.
In rich countries like in America, right? Go back to the Civil War and think, what would a super fund have done? And presumably they'd have run all the same sort of arguments that you were talking about before. Like, well, I don't want to pick a side here. I'm not sure about this, but, we are invested in a lot of these plantations and they do own a lot of slaves. Maybe we could ask some questions of, the housing and the other conditions the slaves are being kept in. So my fear with all of this stuff, and again, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to pull on any lever I can to try and fix problems that we face right now, is that almost by definition, when we go down this path, we kind of leave morality at the door. It's very hard to say, well, actually, you know what, I think that's just wrong and you shouldn't do it. We're kind of forced to think up arguments. We're forced to create new disclosure laws. And again, don't get me wrong, any port in a storm, but I think in 100 years' time, when people look back and think, all right, knowing what we knew about climate change, were there really financial institutions that were okay with funding new coal and gas? Because just to be clear, the answer is yeah. They think it's a great idea. They think it's a responsible use of your money. So I don't think it's binary, but I think while we're talking about the opportunities for the leverage and the turbulence and the disruption and the voice that all this can provide, we've still got to keep another eye wide open to say, you know what, some of this stuff's just bad and should be stopped.
On that front, I would kind of like to put in a bid for the kind of disruptive actions that you were you were kind of pointing to a moment ago, Melanie, so part of, part of what I've looked at in my own work is, this question of ESG risk, how we understand ESG risk, and what scope there is to expand ESG risk, to create new ESG risks, to make the ESG risks that, that currently are considered, to grow them, right? And so the fossil fuel divestment movement is a good example of this. Some of the people that I interviewed for my work, talked about the fact that climate activists created risks associated, and there are all sorts of limitations. I talk about them a lot, but we've had a lot of pessimism already, and I'm ready to be optimistic. The climate movement created risks which didn't exist before, and of course there are economic dimensions to those risks as well. There are some structural economic factors, and for that reason, I think it's important that we bring our whole selves to these kinds of questions. We're asked to participate in. We've talked a bit about the kind of compulsory nature of superannuation, right? We've presented superannuation and other market-based approaches to politics and other things as individual, avenues for individual action, as a choice, as vehicles for individual responsibility. They're actually compulsory and collective, right? And so one of the things that I try to advocate is that we bring our whole selves as workers, as students, as investors, if you want, to these problems. And part of how we can do that is by taking other forms of disruptive action and various forms of political action to create risk and to expand risk. And I think the BBS campaign in relation to Palestine is a good example of that. It's not just a boycott, not just a divestment, not just a sanctions campaign. It's a campaign that aims to take targeted action, to bring. To make the economic impacts felt in the Israeli economy, to create pressure, right, from various actions and various angles. It's similar to what a lot of the fossil fuel divestment movement has tried to do. And I think that's a really kind of compelling reason to, the financial campaigners in the climate space can say, look at all these ESG risks, and then, we have people locking onto coal trains and making those risks seem much greater. That's for me, an optimistic way to think about how to engage with finance.
That's a good segue into the second section, which is your work on social movements. Being at the university and certainly looking at global movements for human rights, there are certain groups that are doing more than their fair share of the heavy lifting, and I'll talk about, mention students, unions, particularly in relation to the strike climate, the school strike climate, and now the encampments, which of course have forced the university to look at its investment policies. How have we got to a place where these groups are doing the heavy lifting, and it's not being done at more established institutions?
It should be. I mean, it's always people who are at the pointy end of injustice who lead the fight to change that, and I think it should be that way, albeit that that means those people have to do a lot of work. But also, I think it's important that it's working people and students and people of colour, Indigenous peoples movements who are staking a claim to decide what ethical means. We've heard a bit about having financiers deciding for us what nuclear weapons are controversial. We should be staking a claim in those debates, and we'll decide what ethical is, and we'll do it collectively. I'll just say something too about the encampment and the kind of, we have now this working group, this investor working group, considering whether or not the University of Sydney should divest from companies that may be profiting from the genocide in Gaza, and that's happening because of the student encampment. That's a really good example of disruptive political action, which has led to this research being undertaken. And we've also just heard about all these messy, complex financial structures, right? If that group does come back with a recommendation that the university should divest itself from those firms, that is going to be extremely complicated. And for me, that's great. It's great to throw spanners in the works, to expose how complicated these structures are and kind of, disrupt them as far as possible.
You're shaking your head.
I
Is
agree.
there anything you'd like to,
I Well, I agree, and I think that the sort of civil action is an incredibly powerful voice of the ordinary person. Litigation, though, is also another way in which to disrupt. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think that's why I stress these things like the due diligence of the Corporations Act. The tort action that was brought by Sharma 2 years ago against the government. I know we're talking now about companies, but against the government about whether it should give an additional license for a coal mine. That's a tort-based negligence action. It didn't get up in the end, but it's exactly the sort of thing that really pushes, to Claire's point, pushes the agenda literally onto the front page of the newspapers. Looking, what is this? And you can, the journalists did a good job describing why it is, why that's being litigated the way it is. They didn't have to get into the finer legal details. But I do think that you have to take the levers, as Richard said, that are available to you. You can't, if you are looking to say you shouldn't be doing this and it is immoral, then one of the ways in which to do that is to have regulatory authorities that give you the tools to do so, either to force you to be more open, to be more transparent, or indeed to make you liable to prosecution or to suing in a civil case. I remember years ago when business and human rights was still sort of a glint in most people's eyes, and not every law firm and every consultancy firm, as is the case today, has its own ESG and human rights consultants, because there was a day in which there was nobody like that, nobody was doing it. I remember doing some work. I was asked to do some work with a very big mining corporation. And in the room, alongside me talking about this mining corporation and its human rights responsibilities, was somebody from a very big law firm. And the big law firm were the ones that they ultimately listened to, of course. They're not going to listen to an open-toed, sandal-wearing human rights professor, are they? But the big law firm just said, where is the litigation? If there is a problem that you're facing that would lead to a court, that's what we need to focus on. None of this stuff that the professor is talking about, looking into the distance, looking onto the horizon. Now, in a way, the two could be conflated, because the horizon will eventually be, or the litigation will catch up with the horizon. But the point is that that's what many companies really do look at. They fear reputation outrage, where their reputation and their share price drops. Or litigation makes them embarrassed by the fact that they've got a human rights case being brought against them, or a due diligence or a modern slavery case being brought against them. So I do think that's an important part of the milieu, to bring in as much regulation as possible to give people who are activists, as well as shareholders, the opportunity to pull another lever.
I just want to add that I think company directors, company executives, trustees of super funds are making moral and ethical decisions all day long, every day. I'll give you an example or two in a minute. But they're usually making these decisions in the complete absence of any scrutiny, in the complete absence of people looking over their shoulder and thinking, really, was that the right decision to make there? And people making immoral decisions have, or I would think immoral decisions, questions where the morality might be challenged. The thing they love is complexity. The thing they love is doing it in secret. And the reality is there's a lot of power in some of this investment, in some of using investment status to challenge these things, purely because it does bring some visibility. So let me give you two very quick examples. Rio Tinto decided to blow up Yukon Gorge. Humans did that, okay? It wasn't the company that did it. It wasn't the process that did it. There were some humans who went, it's worth more as iron ore for us than it is in Indigenous heritage. Stuff it, let's blow it up. That took a human to do that. And we lose power when we think a company did it, right? There's a person there and their name was on that decision. And similarly, when the Banking Royal Commission was going on, Westpac took a pasting one day and the CEO took a pasting. He didn't cover himself in glory. And the front page of the papers on a Wednesday or Thursday were basically saying, oh yeah, but the chair of Westpac's decided to stick by the CEO. They think now's not the time for change. And then the following Monday or Tuesday, the papers were saying, oh, having spoken to investors over the weekend, the chair had changed his mind. But he hadn't spoken to investors over the weekend. He'd spoken to our trustees and our super funds and the people they delegated it to, their chief financial officer or something. But the point is, there's like an ethical decision to be made. Is this CEO, should they be sacked for this or shouldn't they? These are human decisions made by humans that we're kind of trained to think aren't humans making decisions. And I think one of the real opportunities that a lot of this kind of financial campaigning does or has is it opens up the fact that a human decided to blow up Yuk and Gorge. All right, and we can find them, and we can find their boss, and we can find the people who said that was fine. And they hate it, right? They absolutely hate it. They would much prefer just to have the company getting criticised. So yeah, I think it's limited, but it's not lacking in power, particularly when you can hone in on sort of 0-1 moral choices of how on earth did your company decide to do that? Because your company never decided to do anything. A human at that company actually ticked off on it, and they hate being exposed for it.
Right. So how do we, anyway, there are other questions. I mean, how do we get humans to behave better? But David, I am
With fear and embarrassment. I mean this and shame.
Yeah,
No, but the same thing. Legal cases bring all that out. They find the legal case finds. Like, look at the Robodebt stuff. I mean, appalling with the Corruption Commission. But we know the humans at Centrelink that went, yeah, stuff it. Let's do that. We know who they are now.
Going back to law, and I must say I feel, whether it's a real comfort or a perceived comfort, that there is the ICC and the IJ and now making these rulings, but just on a university level, and I'm going to give this question to you, David. We've had the campus access policy, which was pushed through following at the time of the encampments. The School of Law has written a letter, of which you are a signatory. It's a really impressive letter, looking at that questions the efficacy and the process that came to the campus access policy. Now, as the head of human rights law at Sydney University, how is it that a place like Sydney University, where moral obligations should be as central to what the university does, how is it that has gone down the path of denying these fundamental freedoms to students?
Well, it's still open to question as to whether they are going to get that through. But yeah, I mean, if there's a place to have open discussion, it's got to be universities. I'd say it's also the streets, but it's got to be universities, and we should be leading the charge on this. There should be a presumption that speech is allowed. Of course, there are limits on speech. The typical shouting, firing, packed theatre, inciting hatred, or violence, for sure. But generally speaking, people should be free to voice even strongly held opinion, even opinions that people will find uncomfortable or indeed even embarrassing. That, I think, is part of life. If you're not feeling uncomfortable and embarrassed and outraged by things that you're hearing on an everyday basis, then you're not listening, are you? I would think we should all find things ultimately challenging. So I think the university is taking a wrong turn in trying to play God, as it were, decide who can have the voice and who cannot. I think it should be a place where you have a presumption to speak your mind. The limits on that are the ones I've just outlined.
For those who don't know, the campus access policy is a policy that was pushed through without any consultation. It's in a 6-month trial period, as I understand, but it involves things like 3 days' notice to put up a poster, 3 days' notice which may or may not be approved, 3 days' notice to hold a stall on campus. And this is I think Nick is here. You're still the head of NT even until tomorrow or this week, who's been very active on this, and it affects all sorts of activism on campus. So it is a real concern.
And
It's,
it's already being used against students.
Yeah, and it's already used actually.
it's remarkable.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
Yeah. Okay, so the final question in this slide, we're back to climate change. So, even with climate change, there is a global consensus that there are targets. There are UN bodies and global climate bodies that have been established to deal with this. But there's still little progress that we're making with those targets. But what is worse is climate justice. Now, we've looked a lot into climate justice, where we can't, on basic things like climate change, we can't come to an agreement, where the facts are there. How do we redistribute the impacts of the climate catastrophe in this? I know that's a big question, but in this kind of environment, and particularly with the work that you're doing with leaders in the Pacific, who are feeling the brunt of the climate catastrophe.
Look, I don't mean to be flippant, it's just horrible to talk about this. So we hosted a Note Tong on a trip to Australia earlier this year, former president of Kiribati. I've known Anote for 15 years, back when he was president. The guy has just spent his life trying to persuade the world not to destroy his country in its entirety. And he spent a month out here in February talking to Australians about why we need to tackle climate change. And his argument at the moment is, well, Kiribati is gone. It's gone. We've broken that. It won't be there at the end of this century. He's in Australia trying to get us to think, do we want to follow that? And this is a terrible thing to hear a man in his 70s talking about the fact that his grandkids won't live in Kiribati for the rest of their life. We, opening new coal and gas right now, we've taken that off the table. He's given up on saving Kiribati because if you accept the science of climate change, which he does, which is why he's dedicated the last 20 years of his life to try and stop it, if you accept the science of climate change, Kiribati is gone. We're just haggling about how fast it's gone, but it's gone. So here's a guy, literally in his dying days, still travelling the world, saying, are you sure you want to do that to yourselves? Do you want to do that to the people living in the Tiwi Islands? Do you want to do that to people living in the Torres Strait? How are people living in Manly going to cope? Just, on behalf of people in Kiribati who you ignored, who were stuffed, I still thought I'd come here and offer you some wisdom and guidance. So it's a terrible question to ask about how we can be kind of fair about this, because to be clear, we haven't been, and we're not. And in Australia, we spend far more on assistance to the fossil fuel industry, subsidies, than we do on the Pacific. Right? Australia is a generous people. Australians are a generous people. Australia is a generous country. We give more than half of the gas we export away for free. That's kind. That's generous to these foreign owners. Give yourself a pat on the back. We're not xenophobic. We love foreign gas companies. We give them more than half the gas they export for free. We spend in addition to giving them free gas, we spent $14 billion on fossil fuel subsidies last year. We're a generous people, just not to anyone in the Pacific. So could we make decisions today that mean maybe the Solomon Islands don't get sunk, maybe the Tiwi Islands don't get sunk? It's not too late for the world. It's too late for Kiribati. If you take science seriously, it's too late for them. It's not too late for other low-lying island states. It's not too late for parts of Australia. But yeah, we could afford justice like that. If we just dropped a lazy $360 bill on nuclear subs that 10 years ago, 3 years ago, we didn't even know we needed. Like I say this literally, we are so rich that we can waste $360 billion on subs and it's fine. We're so rich that we just had $250 billion worth of stage 3 tax cuts, and that was fine. We're so rich that we can spend $14 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies. It's fine. If we just took any of that and were willing to share it with the people who need it at the most, climate justice would be cheap. But we're far more concerned with being generous to the fossil fuel industry this late in the game than we are to people in the Pacific or other huge tracts of the developing world. But don't think for a minute we can't afford to do it. Sorry to make it simple, we don't want to. Not we, not you, but maybe that person sitting next to you. Someone is voting for the status quo.
Look, there are so many good questions that came in with the registrations. I'm not going to have time to get to them all, and I do want to open the questions. But there was one from Colm. I'm just going to bring your question in about a study from Queen Mary University in London, looking at the destruction or the annual emissions coming out of Gaza. Okay, so I'll just go to the second part of the question. Are there any legal mechanisms available to hold governments accountable for military emissions and environmental destruction, either in Australia or overseas? And are there any ongoing or upcoming cases you know against Israel for the environmental impact of war? I don't know if that covers your areas of expertise. Anyone? We can move on to a lot of other questions.
I mean, I don't know the answer to the question about whether there are mechanisms. I do think that climate litigation is one of the most interesting spaces, and you referred to this a little bit, but it's one of the most interesting and dynamic spaces of action around climate change, I think, partly because it often speaks to the question of climate justice, but also I think it expands ESG risk and makes, forces financial institutions and corporations to take more seriously questions related to climate change. But I don't know the extent to which, what avenues specifically there are around military emissions. But it's clear that military emissions are enormous, but already were an enormous problem, but the stats are in there, but I've seen them elsewhere too. But the amount of emissions associated with the bombardment of Gaza are extraordinary.
I mean, there is an analogue because there have been actions in the EU against big mining corporations like BHP and Shell, and holding them responsible for a certain level of climate change action, indeed beyond what was required in legislation, because it was expected that is what a big corporation should do. That's really cutting-edge litigation. There's an analogue there to say, well, BHP and its mining operations could be seen as somewhat similar to a military who are also emitting climate change gases and destroying the climate. So I presume there will be ancillary litigation on that. I think the primary will be, of course, based on international war crimes, but the ancillary might then be the environmental impact as well.
I have a technocratic and terrible answer. So the way the accounting rules work, Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore, we're the world's largest exporter of metallurgical coal, and when China burns our coal to turn our iron ore into steel, the emissions count for them, not us. All right? So the accounting framework is all about where it happens. So, well, I hate to say it, I kind of think wherever the bombs are going off, our accounting rules would suggest that's where the emissions count, or we're ignoring them. Either way, it's pretty bad.
And look, just one other question from here, because I think it's something that maybe we've all done. I certainly have written to my super company to complain about where my money is being invested. And this is a question that came in on registrations. I recently signed an email to Unisud which carefully considered their vote to stop the fracking in the Beetaloo, thank you, sub-basin. Unisuper's response was, all decisions made with the intention of achieving the best financial outcome for our members. It's a frustrating response and implicates all of us. What will it take to get financial institutions to consider the best outcome for the environment?
Pressure and legislative change and good court cases.
Yeah.
You've got to open them up, that's right. the complexity and the secret negotiations and manner in which boards conduct themselves may remain secret, but the outcome is identifiable and challengeable. How did you reach that decision? And was it taking into account all the necessary due diligence requirements? I think those are the sorts of ways in which you can slowly open up what are otherwise opaque decision-making processes.
And also just, you know, the worst thing you can do is nothing. All the super funds are imperfect, but, you know, my advice to people with super funds is the same with politicians. Quit loudly,
Yeah.
you know, express pressure, put pressure on, tell everyone you're putting pressure on. The worst thing you can ever do is write to an MP saying, I hate you, I've always hated you, and I heard what you said yesterday, so now I hate you more. Right? The best letter you can write is, I love you, I've always loved you. But that thing you did yesterday, you lost me now. So same with your super fund, you know, I think, and if you are going to quit, tell them why you quit. You know, so I do think shopping around is better than not shopping around. You know, there are more and less ethical screens. There are people that take those screens more and less seriously. You can put some effort into finding them. You shouldn't have to. Like, I'm not allowed to sell Milo or a chocolate drink that says doesn't have much rat poison in it. Like, there aren't many products where we're like, oh, most of them are shit, but some are safe. Like, we've actually flipped all this. Like, you have to go find the ones that don't have nuclear weapons and fossil fuels in them. Right? We've kind of put an active burden on you to find the not shit ones. But while that active burden is there, I would encourage you to use it. I would encourage you to shop around. But yeah, if you're going to quit loudly. Write to them before, tweet about it after you do it. You know, because these are precious, delicate little snowflakes that are obsessed with their reputation, so harm them.
There were a lot of questions about is there a super fund, are there super funds that you recommend?
No. I mean, no. Like, I mean, as you said, they do things differently, but I think it's difficult to say some are more ethical than others because they're just different. And, you know, I don't know, my take is that there's not really more ethical or less ethical, there's just we invest in this kind of shit thing and we invest in that kind of shit thing. But what I do definitely agree with, like, not doing nothing, that there are, but for me it's more around, you know, there are organisations like Market Forces which look to collectivise our, our capacity to vote with our dollars, which I really like, or, you know, organisations and activist movements that seek to, you know, to create more risk for investors, which is what, you know, that question is pointing to, you know, what is the financial risk, right? And albeit limited, I do think we have some capacity to increase financial risks associated. I think we have the capacity to create financial risks associated with ethical issues.
You can also hold them to account if they do have a human rights or environmental policy, and then it's shown that they are not living up to it. For instance, ANZ was held to account 5 years ago, by the OECD National Contact Point, which is somebody who sits in Treasury here in Australia, because they had a human rights policy that said they would make sure that the sorts of entities they would fund would not be involved in such things as modern slavery or displacement of Indigenous people. And yet it was found that what they were doing was that they were financing a Cambodian sugar king who was indeed kicking everyone off his property and paying them nothing and no compensation. And as a consequence, they were exposed, yet having had this really Rolls-Royce bells and whistles human rights policy for what they were doing in practice. And indeed, the rapprochement was reached, and they, via culpa, they admitted that they had done something wrong. They withdrew their funding and paid some form of compensation. So there are ways in which to do this if you hold them to account, but you need to sort of do the research, as Richard was saying. For a lot of us, that's not possible. It's not easy. But then it does rely on people like us who are informed who can do it.
Okay, I think we're ready for questions from Phil. We have Seville, who's our wonderful intern, who has the roving mic. Okay, we've got, oh, sorry, okay. Maybe Amy there, I think I saw her hand, and she is actually, I I'm going to out you. On the staff representative on the board of UniSuper.
Hi, so Amy Griffiths, Trustee Director of UniSuper. One of your top 5 funds in the country. That's a great question. Thanks for having me. I'm also a school manager at the School of Humanities here, so I've got multiple roles. And I just wanted to say, taking your point up, Dennis, around superannuation. Actually, most of us probably, I'm assuming most of the people in the room have something to do with universities. So if you're a university staff member, continuing or fixed term, we're actually contributing 17+%, not just the 10. So, which is actually partly why UniSuper is such a big fund, because for many years it was the forced default fund for the higher education industry, for the 37 member universities. And our members have been putting in year on year 17% of our actually quite good wages, thanks to the NTU and our unions. And on that, so I just have to say that UniSuper is a little bit different in that it has a representation model. So I'm a representative director. I was elected by the consultative committee, by professional staff on that consultative committee. And right now, if you're a Sydney Uni's staff member, and I'm assuming there's a few of you here, it would be great if David or Claire were running in the current election, but I'm guessing you're not. But right now we have an election open for UniSuper, for the consultative committee. And that's how members have a real say, in our fund at least, around the decisions at board level. So I'm actually receiving a love letter from any member from UniSuper. I'm open to them. Occasionally I get the odd complaint letter, but surprisingly few make it through. Sorry?
Just wondering if you have a question.
Question actually is around, it's just around, did you know, I guess, if I need to phrase it as a question, that we do have a representative model for UniSuper, as do industry super funds. So all industry super funds have reps on their boards. So it's not just a quiet space of independent directors, and the most successful funds in this country are industry super funds. So I guess it's a word of empowerment that actually the people in this room have more say than perhaps we realised. And voting in elections, please.
Yeah.
And joining in.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we could have direct elections of trustees to super funds. And
I would that.
yeah, no, but I mean across the board, and it's not common.
In the room.
I've always been intrigued by if ANZ commits an offence, ANZ gets fined $20 million, the shareholders lose $20 million. But if an industry super fund breaches a rule and gets fined $20 million, the people who were suffering suffer more. How do we correct that?
Well, actually, one of the ways, if it works out, is director's duties, because the director then is held responsible individually, not a corporation.
Not the directors of ANZ didn't pay their $20 million.
Yeah, but the director would be held personally responsible. That's what directors' duties do under corporations law. If this ambit claim to say that you must take on board environmental and human rights issues was to be successful, and this is still very much a ambit claim, it's not definitive yet, that's the sort of thing that would be sheeted over to individually to a corporate director. So therefore it would avoid this problem of the shareholders, as it were, or us as the super contributors suffering.
So they walk away.
Well, not if they're fine, not if they're fine, no.
Yellow.
They haven't been.
As I said, they haven't yet, you're right.
Thanks for the opportunity to ask the question. Climate activists, what are the best things that you, panel, would suggest that climate activists can do to bring about change?
We've talked about quite a few, I guess. I mean, I think one thing that that comes to me at the moment, partly because I just maybe gave a class, I talked in a class earlier today where I was talking about legacies of colonialism and climate justice. You know, and partly, you know, a lot of what we've been talking about today, we've been talking about climate justice, but we've also been talking about the war in Gaza the assaults on Palestine, which has some serious, colonial dimensions, settler colonial violence. So to my mind, we should be focusing on how to promote climate justice, not just about thinking about what happens in Australia. I mean, of course, the problem of being a massive exporter of coal is significant, but thinking about how we can amplify the voices of people in the global south who are calling for better funding of loss and damage funds. We just heard a moment ago about the amount of money we put into fossil fuel subsidies. So climate financing globally was about $1 trillion a couple of years ago. Fossil fuel subsidies more than 10 times that. Funding for what's needed in terms of climate financing is about the same as what's been going into fossil fuel subsidies as opposed to what's going into climate financing. So things like better financing of loss and damage funds, more funds going to the countries that need it and don't have it, to kind of start unpicking some of those legacies of colonialism. I think for me that's where our energy should be going.
I would say a constant process of education. This is the right place, I suppose, to talk about that. But for instance, one of the entities I follow a lot is called Inclusive Development International, and they have a program. In fact, it's an Australian that runs it, even though it's in the west coast of the US. They have a program called Follow the Money, and it is a forensically based accountants, lawyers, and former policewomen and men who follow the money of bad stuff that's happened by corporations. So they go back behind it to see who financed this. So they're going after the financiers. And it's an extraordinary organisation, of course run with almost no money themselves. But educating yourself on that, and they've done a number of Australian cases as well, again involving ANZ. But educating oneself about those, which I'm doing, as I say, one has to do it all the time, but more people who do that and therefore have that information to hand, then you're able to use it in the environment in which you run, whether it's elections, whether you write letters to your MP or you write them to a newspaper or whatever, you have that ammunition, you have that ability to be able to promote your views. I think that's an important and sometimes undervalued policy.
I think it's dangerous to think about what's the best thing for anyone to do. I think if you have time, use your time. If you have money, use your money. If you have voice, use your voice. Like, it's kind of neoliberal trickery to think there's a way. We're talking about overturning power, right? We're talking about trying to get the most profitable industry in the world to not. And I promise you there's not a thing you can do tomorrow that will get you there. And I think it's this trap of falling into what's the right strategy here. Like, there's no such thing. We've never tried to overturn this amount of commercial power at a global scale with a deadline before. And to be clear, the last 30 years have been a dismal failure. So don't just do what you did last week. That didn't work. Whatever your passion is, great, keep it up, but add a new trick to it. Because if we keep looking for the thing, and we're kind of convinced that evidence will win us the day, no. There's no evidence of evidence-based policy. No, I mean this. This is an academic delusion.
That's why education is not such a helpful thing.
No, education's great, but we're telling people. I'm an economist. I'm an escapee from academia. We're teaching thousands of kids every year that policy's based on evidence. It's not. We just dropped $360 billion on subs. It didn't go to Treasury. You know this? It didn't go to Treasury. There was no modelling for $250 billion worth of tax cuts. How did it happen? Because people with constitutional power said, do it. So stop it with the evidence.
Yeah. So just can I have time for two more? I know, Julie, you've got your hand on the mic. There we are.
Yeah, sorry. But just on that point, like, it's an incredibly depressing talk this afternoon. Sorry. But I'm just wondering about, obviously evidence doesn't work, and looking at the pros and cons doesn't work because you outlay 14 billion there, half of gas is given away, Kiribati has gone under, we're all going to die. So I'm wondering, of the three of you, kind of slack-jawed, know nothing, do nothing, crippling apathy that is making that reality happen. How do you negotiate? What is missing in the middle? If evidence isn't going to work, what is the missing piece to link us up to be activated by that horror? Whether it's Gaza or climate change or whatever.
I've just got to say I disagree that evidence is crap. You've got to, what's the option? What's the option? What did you say? We won't pay any attention to evidence.
Let me clarify something.
Just let me finish.
Okay.
It's all done in rhetoric, it's all done in persuasion. It's all done in politics and all just in vocalising on any shit that comes out of your mouth. That abnegation of responsibility for rationality and reason seems to me a prescription for our doom. We may not succeed by using evidence, but by God, that's what we should be doing, especially in a place like this. You've got to be looking at evidence. You've got to be looking and finding what shows you what is fact and what is fiction. If you don't do that, we're in a sense of utter despair, as you just said. So it may not work, but that is the way to go forward. Rationality and reason. Jesus, if we didn't learn anything from the Enlightenment, surely we learned that. But it's not just about where we were born into and what. It is about using our brain. I've just got to say, I want to use that, whatever facilities it has.
Spoken like a true lawyer.
I have to. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use evidence to persuade these people. You knock your socks off. If evidence works on you, fantastic. There is no evidence that will stop Chevron wanting to expand. None. There is no evidence that will make people who make tens of billions of dollars a year stop. Only power will make them stop. The question is, does evidence make Scott Morrison or Anthony Albanese take on Chevron? History says no, it doesn't. Now, does evidence help motivate you to go and vote differently? Maybe. I didn't say evidence doesn't matter in the way we want policy, but if you want to know why Chevron does what Chevron does, and if you want to know the only power in the world that can stop them, there was no evidence behind the subs. They wanted to do it. There was no evidence behind the tax cuts. They wanted to do it. There was no evidence behind the inland rail, which, by the way, went from 4 billion to 30 billion, but it's fine. When they want to do stuff, they do stuff. I'm in the evidence business. I run a think tank. I do research all day long. But I don't do evidence because I think, oh, if I just get my brief in front of the PM, you'll go, oh, fuck, Richard, I didn't realise.
Yeah, but that's not what's been said.
But you're verbaling me.
But that's not what's been said here.
Well, it's what I said. That's why I tried to interrupt, and you didn't want to let me interrupt. So evidence has a role, but don't for a minute think that your elected representative will go and have the hardest fight of their life and risk the wrath of the fossil fuel industry because you gave them some evidence. If you don't give them some backbone, if you don't make them fear you, the voter, more than they fear the fossil fuel industry, we're stuffed.
I think you're actually madly.
I agree.
with each other.
Yeah, I know.
think you're actually madly agreeing with each other. But I know that Ihab's got some final comments to make, but before he does, I just have a couple of announcements. On Wednesday, you would have had some flyers on your chair. There is a public forum on campus political freedom and the new McCarthyism, critique and protest since October 7th. So please come to that. Ihab will also be speaking at that. Then on the 24th of October, Richard is back at Sydney University, in case you've forgotten, to talk about a Sydney Ideas event on mental wealth and what a wellbeing economy might look like. And of course, we hope you join us on the 18th of November for the Sydney Peace Prize Lecture and Award Ceremony, where the Secretary-General, Javan Chakavan, will be in Sydney to accept the award on behalf of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement. And I just wanted to also mention President Ramos Porter, who was in Sydney last week as a guest of the Australia Institute. And I'm going to leave you with a quote that I'm paraphrasing. Thank you, Natalie, for writing that quote for me. The Pope was came to visited East Timor for the 25th anniversary of independence, So what Ramos says on the Pope's recent visit, he reminded me that we must never give up on peace. The greatest power that any country has, and he points to that Australia has, the US has, Israel has, is moral power. But if you lose that, all you have is weapons. So catch that on, it's recorded, isn't it?
Yep.
This address, which I thought was very good. Once you lose your moral power, that's, yeah, you don't have much else. He had.
Thank you, and would like to thank our speakers and Melanie for organizing this. So Claire told us that our ethics being incorporated into the dynamics of profit making, and possibly we still within the same crisis. Richard told us, okay, there is a space potentially of action within the system, and David told us that reform is something we could consider. Yeah. We had differences, but it is very clearly that there is consensus, that there is a crisis. Yeah. And even though just people coming from very different backgrounds, okay, just in terms of economy, law, there is a sense that there is a crisis, and there is a consensus that the regime that we have is not delivering. Yeah. And the question is possibly the difference why it is not delivering. Yeah. We had many issues, but I would like to recall Robert Meister's book, After Evil. David's book is Necessary Evil. And Robert Meister in his book talks about that the modern witness of atrocities, yeah, they are struggling between the tension of saving their souls and maintaining their position of privilege. Yeah. And Claire told us that superannuation is a space of a privilege, yeah, where you have 7 countries, you have the 90% investment in superannuation. So possibly the struggle is based on this tension between saving the souls, resorting to ethics and thinking with ethics, but at the same time, yeah, there is a question of saving the privilege. And this possibly limiting the agency, the missing link of action. You know? And this missing link of action in this case, yeah, leads us to a very destructive future. The first one, in Palestine, in Gaza, as in Caribas, yeah, we do have unfair distribution of injustice, and this unfair distribution of justice is intergenerational. Yeah. We are talking about a livable future in Caribas and in Gaza, and what links this to the incumbent here, that this injustice is intergenerational. So most likely the new people would not be beneficiaries, yeah, of superannuation. So the question is it possible to take a journey with Richard to go to the CBD, yeah, and reimagine yourself as part of a collective owners of the richest wealth and turn this wealth into a political power? This is possibly our question, okay, how we could deal with this tension between our witnessing catastrophes and atrocities and trying to think of our inaction or indifference in relation to them. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. As I said, there's still so many questions that we didn't go through, but I've got lots of ideas for future panels. So we do hope you continue to follow what the Peace Foundation does, of course follow what the research that the Australia Institute puts out and the work that David and Claire put out. I like the idea that we have a voice. We have to keep thinking about how we can use that voice to make a real impact. So thank you everyone for coming.
I'm not sure we do this, but we do.
Thank you. Have you got everything?
I think so. I just came back.
So how do we just delete that off? Thank you for that. For your help.
That's all good.
You guys
Happy
did
to
a
help.
great job. It makes me feel so much better having sound people here. I know. Pay for the sound. Oh, Lindsay, I'm really pleased.